everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining me. My name is Leah Moore. I am a counsellor at Western College and I'm here today to talk to you all about loneliness and social isolation. Now, I guess let's start by saying that these are, of course, particularly tough, quite emotional topics. So I'd like to remind anyone watching that if you do need to, pause the video at any time and go away and take a break or have a cup of tea. If anything gets triggered for you or comes up, then please do that. And remember to practice self-care, kind of whatever that looks like for you. So, when I was planning for this session, I realised that on this topic, or these topics, at least in my lifetime, there probably hasn't been a more significant time in recent history in which the topic of loneliness and social isolation has been so kind of thrust into the limelight and been so heightened in terms of our collective awareness, as it has been during the last nearly 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. So whether that's you having to self-isolate or spend a long amount of time away from your friends or family or hobbies, so things that we like to connect to, it's probably led to more of us feeling and thinking more about what it is to be lonely or socially isolated or both. And in fact, for many of us, it may have actually been the first time that we've really experienced isolation, and we had to learn to adapt and to cope with that quite quickly. So if we look even further back before the pandemic, loneliness and social isolation were starting to be more publicly spoken about and explored. So the UK government launched their very first loneliness strategy back in 2018 and even appointed a loneliness minister to tackle loneliness. So basically it's now someone's kind of entire job to think about, research and work on the subject of loneliness and how to tackle that within the UK. So it really shows us just how much more in the limelight these subjects have become over the last few years. And for any TikTok users out there that might be watching this, you might have even been involved in a challenge that was happening June of last year, so June 2021. So for those of you who don't know, the social network TikTok launched a challenge encouraging users to talk openly about their experiences of loneliness and their favourite ways to help others using the hashtag Let's Talk Loneliness. So today, over the next 20 to 30 minutes, we are going to be looking at the topics of loneliness and social isolation from a few different angles and perspectives. So we're going to look at loneliness and transitory or short-term feelings of loneliness as being part of the human condition, and some other theories which will help further expand our knowledge around that. And we'll also look at the subtle differences between loneliness and social isolation and where they sometimes overlap and interconnect, but where they also differ. And we're also going to touch on chronic loneliness towards the end of the session. So that's when someone might be feeling lonely all of the time and perhaps for a long period of time, and what this might actually mean for someone who might have found themselves stuck in that cycle of loneliness, which they might actually be struggling to get out of. So today there will be periods of hopefully some self-reflection for you during this session, and we'll also be doing a short activity together to mix it up a bit. So we will look at some fictional examples of people who might be experiencing loneliness and or social isolation, and we'll try to identify the differences together. So let's begin and look at slide 1, which again gives us an outline of what we're going to be covering today. So As mentioned, we'll be touching on some definitions, some kind of facts and figures, some theories around relationships, attachments, and developmental stages and how these are relevant to these topics. And also loneliness and self-esteem, as well as I said, that activity we're going to do. Okay, so let's kind of jump in and start looking at some definitions here. So here are some definitions that I found helpful. So we're going to start with loneliness. So loneliness can be defined as a state of distress or discomfort that results when we perceive a gap between our desires for social connection and actual experiences of it. And it's like a deep, empty pit in your stomach. And just to add here, as we've touched on, we can experience transitory or short-term loneliness, so from time to time, or we can experience chronic or long-term loneliness. So as we can see here and probably all connect with on some level, loneliness can be a pretty painful feeling. So if we look at some of the words that have been used here in the definitions, we can see distress, discomfort, and like a deep, empty pit. So it's by no means an easy one to sit with. And although loneliness can be described from an existential perspective as something that is part of the human condition and what we all feel from time to time, it is also a subjective experience in the way that we do experience and maybe feel it in different ways. So we've touched on one of those definitions, like a deep, empty pit in your stomach, which I think is a really nice kind of sensory example of what it can feel like to kick us off. So I would like for us to take a few moments here for you to connect with what does loneliness feel like to you as an individual. So just to be clear, this is just an invitation. So if it's something you don't feel comfortable with, that's absolutely fine. You can kind of skip over this part and rejoin us. But I'm just going to give us a few moments, around maybe 30 seconds, for us to think about what does loneliness feel like. So it can feel a bit strange to do something like this, but noticing what comes up for us and for you can be really valuable. So maybe have a think about, where do you feel it in your body? Are there any sensations or thoughts that come up? And just notice. So we're going to start those 30 seconds now. So thank you for those who kind of took a moment with me there to reflect on this. So if this is something that you found helpful or were starting to find helpful, I would encourage you to go away and further explore this, either by yourself or with another person. And one helpful way for us to connect with how we're feeling is that we can sometimes turn to quite creative forms. So we can draw or write, or we can look at colours which might resonate with loneliness. So we'll see on this slide here that I've actually gone ahead and included a couple of colours that I associate with loneliness and how I as an individual experience that loneliness when it crops up for me. So we have a blue and a dull grey and a black. So I think for me what this represents is that loneliness can sometimes feel like a really kind of dark and desolate place in my experience. And maybe, again, just take a moment to reflect on whether any colours came up for you in that exercise. Okay, so now let's move on and look at a definition of social isolation. So, social isolation is described as the lack of social contacts and having few people to interact with regularly. And this can often, but not always, lead to feelings of loneliness. So, you'll notice that in this definition, there aren't many emotive or feeling words in here as there were with the loneliness definition. So, this is much more kind of objective and more factual. So it's a lack of social connections and people around. So there's definitely something about a lack going on here. So what is actually the difference between these two and how do they connect? So let's define the difference. Loneliness and social isolation are different but related. Loneliness is the distressing feeling of being alone or separated. Social isolation is the lack of social contacts and having few people to interact with regularly. You can live alone and not feel lonely or socially isolated, and you can feel lonely while being with other people. So something that can come up quite often, and what I'd like to emphasise here, is that we might actually feel our most lonely when we are with a group of people or another person. So we might notice that by realising that something doesn't quite feel right. Maybe it's that we don't feel like we fit in or we're struggling to connect with those around us. So let's now move on to that activity that that I was referring to earlier. So we're going to now put into practice how we can identify what's actually going on here. So is it loneliness or social isolation or both? So we've got some made up examples here, and we'll start off by looking at our first example, which is of Dan. So Dan is 16 and has just started college. He had a load of friends and still has a load of friends from secondary school. And whilst he was there, he really enjoyed his routine of meeting up with his friends after school to practice the guitar and play other music. So Dan has now made new friends in college, but they have different hobbies and they are much more into sport, which Dan isn't really into, and it's just not his cup of tea. So he often finds himself feeling an uncomfortable feeling when he's around these new friends. And he's noticing that he's actually feeling quite unsure about what to say to them. And this makes him feel like he's on the outside. So is Dan lonely or socially isolated or both? And the answer to this one is lonely. So Dan is really struggling with that feeling of being on the outside, but actually if we look objectively at his situation, he's not necessarily socially isolated. So he has his friends from school and these new friendships which he's building too, so he does have options there. So on, as we said, an objective level, he's not particularly socially isolated, but he is really feeling that loneliness. So the next example is Forza. Forza is 21 and she's a carer for her mum who has health problems. So Forza isn't able to get out much and sometimes feels really quite disconnected from other people her age. And she started to notice that she feels really, really quite sad, and that's especially on the weekends when other people her age are going out with their friends and she's actually at home with her mum. So is Forza lonely or socially isolated? And I think for this example, Forza is sadly both lonely and socially isolated. So if we look objectively at her life situation of being a carer, that might actually have sadly meant that she's ended up having not as many social contacts as she'd have liked because of her commitments and the time involved. So she's feeling quite cut off with that. So that loneliness is actually accompanying that social isolation here and might actually have been the direct result of that situation. And finally, let's move on to have a look at Jazz. So Jazz has just moved away to a remote town in Scotland for work, and it's just him and his dog. Jazz doesn't actually know anybody yet, so he hasn't really kind of got to know people in the town or made new friends, and he doesn't really get out much, but to be honest, he doesn't really mind, and he quite likes his own company. And he spends a lot of time reading and playing with or out walking his dog. So is Jazz lonely or socially isolated? And for this example, we could say that Jazz is currently socially isolated. So he is in that new place and perhaps hasn't made a new social network yet, but he isn't feeling lonely. So maybe here Jazz is actually feeling quite connected with the situation that he's in. You know, he has his dog and his hobbies. So perhaps he isn't feeling isolated or lonely, but actually, you know, we could say from an outside perspective, we could think that he was. So we're going to now move on and touch on some statistics and also stereotypes around loneliness and social isolation to unpick this a bit more. So the first thing that kind of often comes to mind when we think about loneliness could be that we might imagine an older person, so someone who is elderly, who is maybe living alone or in a care home and maybe doesn't spend as much time as they used to with friends or family. And then on the other side of the coin here, when we imagine, for example, young people, we might actually have in our minds a very different image conjured up of maybe a life stage that is very vibrant. We may imagine it's a time in our lives where we are very connected with other people. However, some recent surveys, and the one that I've referred to here is from 2019, so a little while ago before the pandemic, and there are others if you'd like to go away and explore those. But the one in 2019 actually said that of 2,018 to 24-year-olds who were surveyed, nearly 9 in 10 of those people, so 88% of them, said that they all experience loneliness to some degree, with a quarter of them suffering often and 7% saying that they are lonely all of the time. So whilst loneliness for older people is undeniably still a really important issue and one that is continuing to be addressed, thankfully, it is helpful to remember that feelings of loneliness and isolation can impact on us whatever our age or life situation or stage that we are in is. So loneliness does not discriminate. And you might also find yourself at a time in your life where you feel lonely and actually you really didn't expect that to happen, because what your kind of picture or idea of what loneliness is maybe something that's really different or a stereotype that doesn't quite fit with what you expected for yourself. So it can also sometimes be a bit of a shock or more difficult to understand or process. So we're now going to move on and have a look at a couple of theories which can help flesh out this conversation that we're having about loneliness and social isolation a bit more. So for those of you who may have seen my other session on relationships, bit of a spoiler alert, this next part is a bit repetitive, so thank you for bearing with me. But I think what's really important when we think about being lonely and isolated is to connect that with our relationships and our attachments and look at them side by side, because it really does feel like to me that the two are connected and you can't really have one without the other. So Dr. Gabor Mate, who's a really influential theorist who you'll see in the slide here, talks a lot about our attachments and relationships and sees things from quite a scientific evolutionary perspective. And he has a lovely quote which we'll see here where he says that the fundamental dynamic in human life and the most influential factor in the development and existence of human beings is attachment, connection to another human being. So what he means by this is that our relationships and our attachments to other people are really important for our survival. And also our development in the sense of our making a kind of developing a sense of ourselves in the world. So if we were to look at this through this perspective, we do need our attachments and our relationships for our very existence. So the human infant is one of the most vulnerable things on the planet, and when we are born, we do actually need our primary caregiver, so that's usually our mum or our dad, to survive. And we are much more reliant on this for, say, longer than other social creatures, so for example, animals in the wild. So again, if we look at this from the perspective of us as social creatures, this might help explain why loneliness does just feel so painful. Because it may be that it's really touching on that part of us that feels that push to connect and to be a part of something, because we are biologically kind of built to connect. However, as we grow, we also need to experience separation to individuate and develop as an individual. So we're now moving on to look at another influential theorist. So this is what someone called Carl Jung. And Jung said to individuate, which is a bit of a mouthful and is basically just a fancy word for saying to become an individual, we need to separate. So if we look back on what we said earlier about starting off as babies and being very dependent for the first few months of our lives, we actually don't even realise that we are individuals or separate beings at that point. So we are completely kind of merged with our primary caregiver, so usually our mum. And then as we start to grow, we do start to realise that we are in fact separate beings, and we start to realise our uniqueness. So we are a different person, and we're not the same as those people around us who we spend all of our time with. And this is actually a really important stage in the development of ourselves as individuals and for the development of our identities. And what I find interesting thinking about this theory of development and individuation is that we then go through a further stage of separation and development when we separate from our parents or primary caregivers again in adolescence. So again, touching on that delicate time of being a young person. And this is a time when we seek independence, so we may start to focus our attentions on forming new attachments with our peer group, so rather than our parents. And this also coincides with the stage where we do start to do some exploration, so we make decisions about who we are as people, and we think about what we like and what we dislike and what we want from the future. So perhaps if we actually look at this from this perspective, not only can this help further explain why feelings of loneliness can be particularly high with young people, but it also shows us that actually loneliness is a part of our growth and a part of our development. So in order to separate and find our own uniqueness, we need to feel lonely and to be apart. So, okay, we're now going to move on and touch on loneliness and self-esteem. So we've already looked at some definitions and some theories, but the one thing that does come up time and time again when working with loneliness and feels really important to mention here is this kind of hook and connection between loneliness and self-esteem. So what I mean by this is that often if we're feeling lonely, we might try and make sense of why that is. And this can sometimes lead to us experiencing quite critical, negative self-talk, which some of you might be familiar with. So in this slide here, some of these thoughts or this negative self-talk self-talk might be saying things like, is it me? Is there something wrong with me? It looks so easy for everyone else. Why is it just me that feels lonely and on the outside? And maybe if I was funnier or smarter, this wouldn't be happening. Maybe it is me. I must be stupid and unlovable. It's all my fault. And sometimes, sadly, with this negative self-talk, which can end up being quite powerful, this can lead us into a cycle when we actually become stuck in something. And this can make us chronically lonely. So as we've covered already, transitory or short-term feelings of loneliness are completely natural, and they are an important part of being human and developing as individuals and exploring and finding what's unique and different about us. But for some of us, we may actually find that we become stuck in a cycle of chronic or long-term loneliness and isolation. And this can happen when our feelings of loneliness that we've touched on can actually start to negatively impact the way that we talk to ourselves and the way we view ourselves, and therefore the way that we behave. So we might start to further withdraw from our social networks. And let's just have a look at the slide which shows us visually what this looks like in practice for someone. So you'll see here we have that cycle. So it might start off with that realization of the feeling, I feel lonely. And this can then trigger some negative self-talk. So there must be something wrong with me. And that can then impact on our behaviour. So for example, we might think, I'm not going to go to that party later on. I have been invited, but actually I feel rubbish and no one will want me there anyway, so I'm not going to go. Which can lead us to further withdrawal from our social networks, which can then, you've guessed it, hook into that feeling of loneliness, and around the cycle we go. So this can be a really, really hard place to be in. It's not easy. And how do we cope when we are starting to feel like we are struggling with loneliness, or we're starting to get into that cycle? So I think the most important thing to remember is to, if you can, practice some self-compassion and remember that there is nothing wrong with you. And I'm saying that in inverted commas. Everyone feels lonely at times. It is a part of being a human. And when we are in that place, it can be hard to sit with. So we might actually try and avoid these feelings. So by, for example, distraction, by keeping ourselves busy or turning to things which in the long term might not be helpful. So by numbing how we're feeling, by drinking alcohol or taking drugs. And what can be the better, although not always the easier, but the better option is to try and connect with this feeling and try to cope with this feeling by doing something that makes you feel connected with yourself. So that could be anything. It could be going out in nature, reading, creating some poetry, listening to music which really resonates with how you're feeling and mirrors that back to you, journaling about how you're feeling, or talking into a voice recorder like a sound diary. So we can be very much in our own heads when we're stuck in these really powerful feelings of loneliness, and actually doing things that can help us get out of that, either by kind of putting it out and creating something, or getting out and moving your body, that can be really helpful. And maybe it's about being open to trying different things and seeing what might actually work for you. And remembering that maybe this feeling is teaching us something about ourselves. And doing these things can help us to find the wisdom in the emotion. And on this point, it might even be that you are experiencing social isolation, and that feeling of loneliness might actually be giving you some important data about your situation and your social contacts, and maybe even it might even be indicating a wish to expand your social world. So loneliness, it really can be a place of wisdom if only we can stop to tolerate and listen to it. So let's have a look finally at some key points to take away to round this session up. So how do we cope with this? So as we've covered, try and connect with what you're feeling. Know that there is nothing wrong with you. This is a part of being human. Try to avoid distractions or running from the feeling, and do something that helps you really connect, whatever that looks like for you. And remembering that loneliness can be a place of self-learning and development. So it's showing you that you are an individual. And as we said, it's maybe even giving you some important data about your situation. However, we will just end on saying that if your feelings of loneliness are long lasting and they've actually started to affect your daily life, or they are becoming really troublesome, please don't hesitate to reach out to a trusted person or look to explore this with a professional. So for example, by coming to counselling. So that concludes our session on loneliness and social isolation. So I hope that this has been helpful for you today, and that you've been able to perhaps self-reflect on what loneliness feels like for you as an individual, and also that some of the theories and the ideas today that we've covered might have been helpful and resonated. So I guess in general, I want to say that I really hope these last kind of 30 odd minutes have been a good experience for you to further expand your knowledge around these subjects, and to either, if that means either supporting you or supporting another person to go forward and have more knowledge. Okay. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care.